All right, we're going to get started with another Country Drive Theology today. I'm on my way back home. Just spent the morning here at Concordia getting a little bit of studying done and some cleanup done. And so let's answer a few questions. This last Sunday, apparently there was a devotion. I don't know if it was Portals of Prayer or the like, but mentioned Enoch, depending on how you want to say that. He's a character in the book of Genesis, and he has a interesting distinction of being one of the few men who was taken up into heaven. I believe the scriptures say there was this man named Enoch. He lived so many years, and then he was no more. He was righteous with God, walked with God, and he was no more. Enoch then gets a lot of different questions. So one of the questions I got, just so we can address it with everybody, is, how many times has this happened? At least scripturally speaking, I can only think of two off the top of my head. The first one is Enoch in the book of Genesis. The second one is Elijah. Chariots of fire. Elijah and Elisha, they go out towards the wilderness. Elisha has to hang back for a little bit, but doesn't hang back in time before he sees Elijah caught up into heaven in chariots of fire, or whatever it was. The Hebrew is not very clear on chariots of fire, horsemen of fire, something like that. Anyway, so Enoch and Elijah. Now, some people get a little bit interested in other people that are caught up into heaven and the like. Of course, Jesus ascends bodily into heaven. And I think that's what we need to take a look at. What is behind maybe the purpose of these individuals being caught up into heaven? What do we see from Jesus' example of being caught up into heaven? And I think the main point is that it is indeed possible for the flesh to be caught up to the divine, to be caught up into heaven. It teaches us the scriptural truth that on the last day, when our bodies are raised from the dead, they will be reunited with our souls in heaven, that the body actually matters. We treat the body as if it doesn't matter. A lot of that is probably from our evolutionary tendencies in our world today that are false and misleading, because they teach that the body is simply a sack of molecules that can be cut up, changed, and redistributed in whatever way necessary. But the body actually matters. The Psalms say that God had knit us together in our mother's womb, that He knew us from the very beginning, that He loves us enough and has enough care for us that He numbers the hairs on our head. Now, I love my wife, I love my kids, but I've never actually taken the time to number the hairs on their head. So that's the first thing we learn from the story of Enoch. Yes, it's kind of extrapolated out, but it's something to consider. Second thing that normally comes up with the story of Enoch is the book of Enoch. This is a very ancient book. It was ancient even for the early church fathers. And quite frankly, they did not know what to do with it. Is it scriptural? There are definitely parts of it, having read it myself, that sound very scriptural and coincide with things that we see within the scriptures. There are other parts that I have no idea what to do with. So when it comes to the book of Enoch, I like the advice of St. Augustine. He was around, I believe, the 600s, late 500s, early 600 ADs, if I remember correctly. And St. Augustine said, this book was so ancient, and we don't know who the author is. So that's the reason we keep it out of the scriptures, because we don't know for a fact who wrote it. You can tell Augustine wants to include it in the scriptures, but because we have an uncertainty about it, he refrains, he holds back, and looks to the clear testimonies of the apostles and the prophets of books that we know, and the books that we know who wrote, or more or less who wrote. So those are the two things that come up with Enoch. Enoch can be one of these characters that spurs the imagination, and one of the things that we should remember is that we can only go with what is told for us. We would like to know more about these characters. We would like to know more what it means and all these things. But it's not given to us to know. This is what, again, I refer oftentimes to the hidden will of God. There are certain things that are hidden from us. Another thing to consider, with Elijah, we have this prophecy that Elijah was to come again. And the Jews still wait for that day. That is why at the Passover Seder meals, they will usually leave an empty chair at the table for Elijah if he was to come back and party with them. Jesus tells us that it is John the Baptist that is the Elijah to come. And that John the Baptist was the forerunner. So I'm sorry if you're waiting for Elijah to come, you've missed the boat. That's already happened. And it was the forerunner to Christ in John the Baptist. The other thing to think about with Elijah is that he is one that appears with Moses at the Transfiguration. He's kind of this representative prophet of prophets. I don't know, you might call him the first among prophets. Moses kind of being the first among prophets and kind of the leader, the first of the leaders and judges of Israel and all those things. What do we got here? We got some, they're doing some road work out here on the road ahead of me. So anyway, Moses and Elijah speak with Jesus. And the Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus, Moses, and Elijah were speaking about Jesus' exodus. That is, the taking out of. What does that mean? I personally think it is a reference to Holy Week, to the fact that Jesus was going to be crucified and die. He was going to be buried. He was going to rise from the dead, and eventually he would ascend into heaven. What are Moses and Elijah, who have been in heaven, who have seen these great miraculous events coming forth and all these things, what do they want to talk about most? They want to get to the punchline. They want to get to the story of what Jesus is going to do. That is the focus of our scriptural studies and endeavors. So yeah, Enoch, he brings up a lot of questions, probably a lot more questions, honestly, than answers. I think the things that we can learn and apply from his very brief story in the scriptures is the fact that it is indeed possible for the flesh to be taken to heaven. And he's one of the few examples that we get of that. Of course, the supreme example, the one I would focus on, would be Jesus' ascension, proving that if he can take his flesh into heaven, certainly we who have been united with him in a baptism like the one we've gone through will be resurrected in a resurrection like his and be able to ascend into heaven bodily as he has. So those are some of the things I think we can take a story. Another thing is, and if I remember my genealogy, we were talking about this, Bob Bruns and I were talking about this on Sunday. That's another reason this came up, is apparently this devotion was read by many. If it is true indeed that Enoch is descended from the line of Cain, it also, I think, helps us look at the fact that the sins of the father are not imputed necessarily to the son. Yes, the son can follow in the sins of the father, and that God is indeed angry against, several generations of those who hate him. But there is indeed grace and mercy, that the sins of Cain are not given to Enoch. And when he goes through that, Enoch is able to actually be one of the ones that righteously walks with God, and God assumes him into heaven. And so that's good news for us. So anyways, real brief kind of country drive theology, talking about something that came up this week. Hope you enjoy. Hope it gives you some thoughts. If you have any questions, let me know. We'll talk to you later. Blessings. Bye.